Hello. In this lecture, we are going to think about the issue of state scope. In other words, when should we increase state scope or when should we decrease state scope? And this is all about the costs and benefits of having state authority do something versus having the free market or market mechanisms handle an issue. So when we talk about state scope, what we're really thinking of is what should the state do? What should the state leave alone? And I want you to zoom in here on that word should, right? When we see should, we're dealing with the normative issues. And that can be tricky because it's about what is good, what is better, and it can be very subjective. It can be very difficult for us to come up with objective policies when we're talking about shoulds. However, we're often going to see that the shoulds drive the realities that we're dealing with. And in thinking about what should the state do, we're going to try and find some hard facts and some ways to think about issues that'll help us come to better outcomes. So to start thinking about that, what should the state do at a minimum? Well, the state should probably at least fulfill its basic task that it developed for. So quiz yourself a little bit here. According to Hobbes, of course, the Leviathan pictured here. According to Tilley, the theorist who gave us the theory of war making and state making, what was the original purpose of the state? What is the one thing that the state is supposed to do? That's right, protect us, provide public defense. And this we could see as a necessary role of the state. Indeed, it's a necessary role. We really require the state to overcome the problem of anarchy, get us out of that state of nature, and provide public defense, which is a public good. So we all are able to enjoy the security brought about by our national military, by our secure borders, and by the law enforcement within this country. Right? We live in a place where we have law and order because of these things, and that is at a bare minimum what we want the state to do. Another necessary role of the state is actually making the market work in the first place. And I've mentioned this before when we talk about the state versus the market. It's actually much more of a delicate act of line drawing than it is absolutely one or the other. And indeed, the market really requires the state in order to function. It requires the state to sort of lay the foundation, lay the groundwork for the market to be able to work in the first place. So why? Well, for two reasons. The state, with its power of sovereignty and that authority, it provides enforcement for laws, particularly contract laws, and also provides protection of individual property rights. And so think about what the free market requires. If you and I have goods or services that we're going to exchange, what would happen if you said, okay, I'm gonna sell you this service, and you're gonna then pay me, $1,000. You perform the service, so you paint my house, and then I decide not to pay you. Well, the state would come in and punish me there. You could say, no, we have contract law in the state of Colorado, and I can go to the court and I can get that money out of you. The state will enforce that. It will use its sovereign power to enforce that contract law. If somebody steals something, you can go to the police, right? Because you have rights to your own property, and if somebody else violates those rights, the state will back you up, and they will protect you, hopefully. Well, without these things, the idea of basic exchanges, if you don't have secure property rights, and if you can't actually enter into a contractual exchange for goods and services, for currency, well, you're not going to get very far with the free market, right? There's not going to be any trade, commerce, or certainly not investment without this stability. And so this is another necessary role of the state. However, where it will get controversial is when we're thinking about other things that the state can do. And a way that we'll think about this is, where are there market failures? A lot of the time we let the invisible hand work, and it allocates resources much better than a central authority. But there are going to be times when the logic of the free market doesn't actually end up providing outcomes that most people, at least, would see as beneficial. And so most people would argue that there should be, again, normative, should be some input from the state. But how much is where the rubber really hits the road in this debate. The first way we can think of a market failure is that markets underprovide public goods. And remember, a public good is something that if I have access to it, You have access to it. It's non-excludable. Well, market mechanisms are driven by individual self-interest. Firms are working to produce things to sell for profit. Individuals are trying to make the most out of very limited resources and get as much as they can, right? And the magic of the invisible hand is that actually this allocates things so efficiently. It allocates resources extremely well, and as we've talked about, probably much better than any central authority could allocate resources. However, it does not magically provide for high public goods, and indeed, individuals acting in a marketplace to maximize their self-interest, well, often remember the idea of a collective action problem. Even if it's collectively in our interest to have a public good, individually, it's more rational for us to free ride. And so we bump up against this free rider problem, that when we come to public goods, we might not have as much of that public good if we just leave it to the market. And so that's why we call this a market failure. The market is not actually producing an outcome that most people see as desirable. But again, this is quite a tricky playing field, because what I might see as desirable and what you see as desirable could be very different things. So to think about this, let's look at the example of the public good of education. And having an educated populace is something that is really beneficial. This is human capital for a robust economy, so it benefits all of us. And also, as Thomas Jefferson pictured here, would argue, many would say that an educated population is very necessary for a democracy. And indeed, here's the main building, the rotunda of the University of Virginia. And this, of course, is the university that Thomas Jefferson founded. And he was so proud of this that he said, on my tombstone, I don't really care too much about if you mention the Declaration of Independence that he wrote, but he wanted to be known as the founder of the University of Virginia. And he really thought that this well-educated populace would be the defender of liberty by being able to knowledgeably participate in politics. And so we see that this is a public good. If we have a well-educated population, we can have a more robust democratic system, a more fair and just democratic system. This is a great public good to have. Well, the state then provides public universities like the University of Virginia, like Fort Lewis College, of course, and this allows us to have a more educated population. And of course, the state provides compulsory education for the K through 12 level. Now, if this were just left up to individual actors, if there were only private institutions, there would probably be a lot of the public that would not be able to afford school. And so we would have fewer educated people, we'd have a less educated population, and that could have a lot of negative effects. Education is something, like I mentioned, a more well-educated population is likely to be able to contribute to all sorts of problems and to have the skills to grow the economy, to innovate, and so that all people will benefit. And so in this way, we'll talk about education as having huge positive externalities. Now, externalities bring us to the next type of market failure, because while there can be positive externalities, there can be negative externalities. So what is this thing? An externality, this is something that we're going to think about when we think about, well, where should the state step in? An externality can be a type of market failure. And an externality is any consequence of an action or a transaction that is not borne by the people actually doing that action, or not borne by the parties to that transaction. So let's take a very classic example of a negative externality of dirty air. Well, where does that come from? Let's say I'm going to pay my electricity bill and I just want to buy the cheapest electricity possible. And so I'm going to use this sort of the cheapest, dirtiest electricity possible. It's in my individual interest because I'm saving money. The power company has incentives to use the cheapest, dirtiest fuels possible in order to produce electricity, because again, it's in their interest to have the lowest price on the market, to attract customers like me who want to save on their power bills, right? And so the two parties to a transaction in which I'm buying this cheap, dirty electricity from a power company are the power company and me. And we're both benefiting because the power company is attracting my business and because I'm saving money on my power bill. Everybody's happy, right? Not necessarily. There are third parties, all of you people out there in television land that are breathing air that might be more polluted because myself and people like me are buying the cheapest energy possible. This is a negative externality. I don't have to pay the cost for the negative impact my transaction had on the environment. It's external to that transaction. And of course, these can be positive or negative. And so negative externalities are a type of market failure. As we saw with the case of education, however, me paying an institution to get educated, or actually more apt, you all, right, working to pay for an education, right, you are going to benefit yourself. So the parties to this transaction, Fort Lewis College and you, were both benefiting, but broadly, society is also benefiting. There are all these third parties who are going to benefit because your education is going to make you much more likely to go out into the world and to contribute in a really big way with your human capital. So that's a positive externality of that transaction between you and Fort Lewis College that the rest of society gets to enjoy. Well, dealing with market failures can be really tricky, and this is a lot of the time, this is how we're going to think about where we should expand state scope. So when we think about, well, what should the state do? What should the state not do? We're going to say the state should probably step in where the market is providing really bad outcomes. Otherwise, we should probably leave it to market mechanisms that typically allocate resources much more efficiently by allowing individuals and firms to have their choices. Well, one way that we can deal with market failure is the state can simply make rules and regulations, and in a very real way, the state can tell you what to do. And so the state can overcome market failures by simply legislating laws that make those behaviors illegal. And right before you get too alarmist about this, the state can't tell me what to do. Of course it can. Remember, the sovereign state. Sovereignty means that the state has the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And if the state tells you to do something, you'd best listen to it. So you can deal with a market failure like having too few people who are educated by saying you must go to school until you were 16. We're going to provide you with the opportunity for an education, and you must get that education until you're at least 16 years of age, like most states do. Of course, you can also, with the example of the negative externality of polluted air or dirty water from cheap power production, the state can simply say, this is illegal. But states typically work to alter incentives. And incentives is something we're going to think a lot about as we determine what kind of policies we'd like to see the state develop. And they can do this by taxing. For example, you can increase taxes on negative behaviors. And here we have a map put together by the Fiscal Times of the amount of tax revenue that different United States states are getting from different sins, so these sin taxes, right? Taxes on alcohol, tobacco. And the idea is that, people smoking, people drinking way too much, these things have negative externalities because the people who have negative health outcomes, they're going to cost everybody in society more money in health spending. Of course, if people are consuming too much alcohol or even driving intoxicated, they could be killing other people, innocent people. There are all sorts of negative externalities from people over consuming these things. And so the state works to change incentives, to disincentivize using these things by making them more expensive. And this is one thing that all states in the world work to do. They work to actually change behavior in a lot of ways by changing incentives through making undesirable behaviors more highly taxed and therefore more expensive. Well, of course, the state can also simply offer subsidies to try and get people to do things and alter markets in ways that have better outcomes. And so the state might provide grants to get people into certain fields that would have really positive externalities, right? The idea of really working to encourage people to learn skills that are going to benefit all of us. Well, you can see how the state could provide a subsidy or sort of a gift of money to people to incentivize them to enter a certain field. Of course, there can be subsidies for things like having solar power or buying a more fuel-efficient vehicle as well. And so again, the state is working through giving subsidies to try and change incentives. So to recap, we will see the state scope argument be really about, well, where do market mechanisms or public authority work better? And one way to really think about that best is perhaps thinking through market failures. Markets can underprovide public goods, and markets can have negative externalities that affect society at large. And these are ways that we'll see the state working either through regulatory policy or through sort of market mechanisms, trying to alter incentives in order to overcome these problems. Thank you for joining me. Have a wonderful day.